Hi everyone and welcome. I'm joined today by Colonel Jacques Baud, a retired General Staff's Colonel and in the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Services, and also a very prolific author, as many of you have probably read at least some of his books. So yeah, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me in your show. Thank you.
So Trump tends to go a bit back and forth. He seemingly genuinely wants to end this proxy war, but he doesn't seem to be making any headway. So um, he speaks about this being Biden's war, but he continues more and more along the same path. Now, I fully appreciate the dilemma that is he needs to continue the military pressure on Russia, so Russia will also accept some compromise and make some concessions. But as long as there's demand for concessions Russia can't make, and Trump continues to go down the path of yes, supplying weapons, intelligence, and logistics to fuel the war, this seems to be increasingly becoming Trump's war as well. And it seems, at least to me, that this is what the Europeans and Ukrainians are hoping for, to pull America fully into the war under Trump. But how do you see this? Is this now Trump's war?
Oh yes, it's becoming slowly Trump's war as well. And I think the problem, I fully agree with what you said. What I would say in addition to that is that in fact, as in any crisis, it might be at personal level or at strategic level, the first issue that you have to solve is to understand your adversaries. And that's exactly what failed to Trump. He came on the basis of the analysis, I could say, of Keith Kellogg. And that's why I appointed him as special envoy for Ukraine. The problem is that Keith Kellogg didn't understand the nature of the conflict. I think it's very important to understand that unlike what the West has said for now months and years, that Russia is trying to expand its territory, expand or recreate the Soviet Union and Tsarist empire and things like this. The reason why the Russian entered in Ukraine in February 2022 was to protect civilians. That's the key aspect. And in the background of this, you have the issue of NATO, because, as Alexei Arestovich said in 2019, this idea in Ukraine, and this idea that was probably used by the US, or even probably supported in some way by the US, that defeating Russia would help Ukraine membership, or yes, membership into NATO. Therefore, and as Arestovich said in 2019, we need to have a war with Russia in 21-22. That's what he said.
То есть, если Украина получает ПДЧ в НАТО, то тогда мы можем
Тогда
говорить
мы-
о каких-то
Да.
сроках прекращения войны.
Нет, ни о
Стоп.
каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупные военные операции России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию для того, чтобы нас неохотно
То
брали
есть
в НАТО.
Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО?
Конечно, нет, не НАТО. Мы не Они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны НАТО. Перестали быть интересны, как разваленная территория. С вероятностью 99,9% наша цена за вступление в НАТО – это большая война с Россией. А если мы не вступим в НАТО, это поглощение России в течение 10-12 лет. Вот и вся вилка, в которой мы находимся. А теперь давайте выбирайте Зеленского.
Подождите, а теперь если поставить чашу на весах, а что лучше в таком случае?
Конечно, крупная война с Россией и переход в НАТО по результатам победы над Россией.
А что такое может быть крупная война с Россией?
Это воздушная операция наступательная, вторжение российских армий, 4, которые они создали на наших границах, там, осада Киева, попытка окружить войска, которые в АТО находятся, ВОС, операция Объединенных сил, прорыв через Крымский перешейк, выход на на Каховское водохранилище, чтобы воду в Крым дать. Наступление с территории Беларуси, там, создание новых народных республик, диверсии, удары по объектам критической инфраструктуры и так далее. Воздушно-десантный. Вот что такое полноценная война. И вероятность ее 99%.
Когда?
После 21-22 самые критические, 20-22 самые критические эти самые.
And remember, the Arestovich today has become an opponent of Zelensky, but at that time he was the personal advisor of Zelensky. And that's probably the whole issue. And that's the reason why, by the way, as I explained many times, the Russia tried to prevent this membership in December 2021, not in 2028 or 2029 or and so on and so forth, and not even in 2014. It was in December, mid-December 2021, because they realized that if we could short-circuit the membership of Ukraine into NATO, this would in fact make Ukraine more reluctant to start a war in the Donbass, because they knew that attacking the Donbass, as it was stated into the decree taken on the 24th of March 2021, this intervention would prompt a Russian response, which would be a military response, and so on. So that's the whole issue, and that's the reason why we have Sergei Lavrov coming again and again with this issue of the root causes. And that's exactly what Keith Kellogg and Donald Trump failed to understand. And that's the reason why the objective he has to stop the conflict in Ukraine, which is a very noble objective, and we can support that. The problem is that once you have the objective, you should design a strategy that match the ways, the means, and the objective you have selected. And there is no real strategy to address that. So the Americans have an objective, but no strategy, as opposed to the Europeans, who don't even have the objective of stopping the war and have no strategy to continue. And for that reason, they feel that having or keeping the US into the conflict is a solution for weakening Russia, which is ultimately the objective of the Europeans. Now, the problem is that this objective is obviously not reached so far, and there is little probability that the Europeans will achieve this objective of weakening Russia. Neither on the military side nor on the economic and political side. In fact, on the economic side, we see that the Russian economy is working well. They probably have some difficulties because they still have sanctions, but they have an economic strategy that, in fact, circumvented those sanctions and help, in fact, to survive those sanctions quite well. And that goes along with the development of the BRICS and, of course, the alliance with China. Now, on the political side, we have seen as opposed to Europe, by the way, very interesting to see that in the last 3 years, the Russian diplomacy has been extremely active to develop and to strengthen ties with the rest of the world. And that includes, of course, Africa, Asia, and of course, China and India. Meaning that the Russians have not remained focused on the Ukrainian conflict, as opposed to the Europeans, who remain politically, diplomatically, and I would say even economically, it's another issue. Probably they don't have any focus, but politically and diplomatically, they are totally focused on the Ukrainian conflict. As a result, they find themselves quite orphan of a strategy, orphan of objectives. And that's the reason why seeing the US trying to leave the boat is something that is totally unbearable for the European policy. And that's the problem.
You said that the Kellogg's effectively of the West, they do not understand Russia. But is this out of dishonesty or lack of better word, stupidity? Again, I don't want to use strong language, but for example, in March of 2022, Newsweek, they reported about a YouGov poll in which they found that a majority of Republicans, that is 52% of Republicans, believed that Russia was a communist country. I mean, more than 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they thought that Russia was still communist. A majority of them. I mean, it does. Again, I hate to use strong language, but this was a similar theme they had after at the beginning of the Iraq War, where they had polling on the eve of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and you found I think at that point as well there was a majority of Americans who believed that yes, Saddam Hussein had been involved in the September 11 attacks. Is this do they actually believe this? Because with when I look at the Europeans, I also hear Macron. He makes the argument that the Russians are after territory. They're this is unprovoked, this empire. But in the past, he has also recognized that the failure to establish a mutually acceptable European security architecture, one that's not based on zero-sum block politics, that this is something that has to be addressed. I think the phrase has been used, if we create a Europe without Russia, it would unavoidably become a Europe against Russia. So how can you go from this and then say, well, this came out of nowhere. This is just, imperialist Russians hungry for territory. Again, is this... I'm really genuinely struggling sometimes to see if this is dishonesty or well, let's call it ignorance as a more polite word.
It's both, in fact. There is a part of dishonesty and a part of ignorance. And don't underestimate ignorance, because I'm not sure our politicians at large are well educated. They might have the academic degrees, but I'm not sure they are educated in the sense that when you are in a conflict, one of the golden rules is to listen to what your enemy is saying. Regardless of what is your position, whether you may be a party of the conflict or you might be outside of the conflict, such as a mediator. And I have played that role in several smaller conflicts in Africa to mediate some conflicts. And this is always the same thing. You cannot just approach a conflict just with preconceived ideas or just your own ideas or simply with the ideas of one of the parties. You need to approach a conflict with, let's say, the whole picture, not just a part of the picture. And that's very true. Military know that, because when you start to fight, when you start the battle, you need, as Winston Churchill used to say, that sometimes the commander has to take into consideration the enemy. And that's exactly the problem you have. I mean, in the military, we know that, because you cannot fight without an enemy, and you cannot fight if you don't understand what the enemy is doing. Therefore, you have to understand exactly what his intents are and things like this. At tactical level, it's rather, with some caveat here, but it's rather easy to do it. At strategic level, it's something else. You need to have a deeper knowledge of mindsets, politics, culture, different aspects that come into the game when it comes to conflict. But nevertheless, what you need to have, and that's absolutely, there is no substitute for that. You need to understand what your adversary wants, exactly what he's aiming at. And that has not been done in Europe. we keep, and we it's satisfying to have the Russians as communists. And if you read articles, I think it's not isolated case when people speak about commies when they talk about Russians, because they still consider them as a communist. And I think it's also part of this imaginary understanding of the Russians and Soviets. And when you listen to commentators, especially in France, they mixed up Soviet and Russians. They think that the thinking exactly the same, the doctrine is exactly the same. It's not exactly that. You may have some constant, and I have written this book about the Russian art of war, and you may find some constant aspects that went through history despite of the different regimes. I mean, what was developed in the early 20s in the Soviet Union can be found today in some aspects of the military operational art, for example. But the Russians make this difference they make a very clear difference between what is Soviet and what is Russian. Now we play with that, and we see that in Ukraine, by the way, because there is a standing confusion between the Soviet times and the Russian times. And the nationalists or ultra nationalists that are, in fact, the backbone of the anti Russian sentiments in Ukraine are, in fact, anti Soviets rather than anti Russians. But the anti Soviet dimension has overtaken the scene, and today we are talking about anti Russian. And for many, if you look at the Baltic states, is exactly the same thing. They have converted the word anti-Soviet into anti-Russian, period. And they didn't even realize that those who exerted tyranny in their country were, in fact, Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonian people. So, because if you take the KGB, for instance, it was you had an Estonian KGB, you had a Latvian KGB, Lithuanian KGB, and those KGBs, in fact, managed the politics in the country. So, and there is today this they tend to discard this and replace the word Soviet by Russian. So we have this, but it's intellectual dishonesty, because today it makes more convenient to have an enemy which looks like the Soviets, that requires the same preparedness in the West as we had during the Cold War. Remember that most of the military industrial complex we had during the Cold War has been dismantled after the Cold War. And now we are reconstructing, but we can reconstruct that only if we have a similar threat as the one we expected in during the Cold War. And that we try to repeat history, and I think that's wrong. The Russians, on their side, are much more analytical than the West. And first of all, the Russians have understood very quickly, and even I would say well before the end of the Cold War, that the relationship on the European continent, I would say even the Euro-Atlantic space, would evolve in something different. And remember that the whole Helsinki process that eventually led to the creation of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe was initially started by the Soviets. And in the mind of the Russians today, the OSCE remains the model for a future security architecture not based on confrontation, but based on cooperation. And that's exactly what the OSCE is about: Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And that's what the Soviets first imagined and have stated many times, and the Russians later have taken over in order to reshape the whole European architecture. This is something that the West has never wanted to understand. We are in a world in the West where, of course, the military industrial complex is an important part of the economy. I mean, if you look at the US today, we'll see that it's probably the only area of the US industry that has been remained domestic in essence, and is probably the only successful part of the US industry. The rest has been outsourced, and production has been outsourced or dispersed in the world, and that led to the problem we have today with China. But the military industrial complex remained within the US. In Europe, we had a different approach. We had this idea that we should take on the dividends for peace, and therefore we should disband the military industrial complex, which was partly done in most countries, and instead investing in other type of technologies. That's the reason why today we see that suddenly the West realized that it has no military industrial complex anymore. I mean, the West, the European, and now they try to reconstruct it on a very let's say with a lot of funding and all that. But the essence is that the reason why we disbanded our military industrial complex in Europe is because we didn't feel that we needed one. The US, as opposed to that, maintained a kind of permanent state of war with the rest of the world. They managed to have war all over the world, and thus maintaining their military industrial complex. While in Europe, we didn't want to expand that. It was not really what we wanted. It's today that changed with Ursula von der Leyen and so on. We had let's say, and probably with the influence of what Donald Rumsfeld called the New Europe, which is essentially Eastern Europe today, with Poland, Baltic states, and so on, Romania, Slovakia, Czechia mainly, Slovakia a little bit less today, but nevertheless, this New Europe was this Europe that would require to have an enemy. And in fact, I spent 5 years within NATO, and I could see the influence of the New Europe in the thinking that you have within NATO. Because in NATO, when you talk, and when I talk to my peers, basically other colonels, so that's a rather high level in NATO, by the way. And when we talked about the situation, we could see a difference between the French, Italian, even British, by the way, or Germans, as it comes to international relations, whereas the Eastern European countries had a much more aggressive stance towards Russia and all that. So we see that NATO is very strongly influenced by those countries, and it's probably not a coincidence that you have Kaja Kallas as member of one of the smallest country of the European Union, which is nevertheless leading the foreign policy of the European Union. So that shows the importance of this, and that's a massive change in the whole both European and NATO mindset, and that changed our perspective. So today we feel that we have an enemy, which is Russia, and suddenly this Russia, which used to be weak, bad led, no weapons, no ammunition, and things like this for 3 years, today has become the first military threat to Europe, and therefore we should have 800 billion euros to reconstruct a military industrial complex. So there is a lot of intellectual dishonesty into that. We see that how to say that, politics, in fact, takes over the facts. And the strength of the Russians so far had been not to fall into that trap and to remain in an analysis of the situation that remains strongly based on facts. And I could see when I see the reports from the Russian intelligence and I compare them with the reports from Western intelligence, we can see a difference there that slowly the West has become more, let's say, politicized. When I talk about the intelligence services, intelligence have become more politicized than in Russia, although Russia is now a country at war, so we can understand that you may have some biases in the way they approach things, which could be understandable. But nevertheless, you can see that they have a very, let's say, candid approach to the West, while in the West, we tend to have a very strongly biased approach to the West. And the interesting aspect of this, and which is related to the dishonesty or ignorance that you mentioned before, is that we see a growing gap between the European people or population, if you want, and the so-called elites that lead both at European Union level and at country level. And the gap between Macron and his population, Keir Starmer and his population, and so on, is growing. Meaning that this small elite today is, in fact, using the narrative as the way to escape or trying to escape all the critiques and to escape all the movements that happen within the population that may affect the whole stability of the government, as we have seen in Germany, for instance, with the growing the growth of the AfD, for instance, which is considered in Germany as a threat for the government. So we need to lie more in order to have a bigger threat, in order to have to focus on the external threat rather than the internal threat, and so on and so forth. So there is, we have this, and in the United States, you have a similar issue. The antagonism between Democrats and Republicans has become extreme in the last couple of years. Remember the 6th of January 2021 and things like this. That shows that you have the political scene, the domestic political scene, has been polarized on between the different actors, and that's exactly what is threatening our democracies today. The policy that is applied by our politicians are in fact radicalizing the population, are in fact are polarizing the issues, and we see more and more in most countries that the center is disappearing. You have more extreme right, extreme left, and you have, I could say, in some countries such as France, for instance, you have an extreme center, which is quite odd. But so you have this poles that are creating, and it's very hard to have a national consensus on different issues that might be very important at societal level, for instance. But you don't have that anymore, and everything becomes a struggle. Everything becomes I wouldn't say armed opposition, but we are probably not very far from it in many countries. Not in all of them, but in many of them. And that's, I think, it's a very worrisome country. So, but we have a spiral of both ignorance and ignorance and dishonesty that develops in the West. And we see that today, that everybody sees that the situation in Ukraine becomes more and more desperate for Ukraine. Then we have this kind of spiral of dishonesty that increases, where we tend to agree on terrorist activities carried on by Ukraine in different countries. Both, for instance, if you say this Ukrainian politician that was assassinated in Madrid, you had not the slightest comment about this in the West, even if everything points at an action of the Ukrainian Secret Service, which, by the way, has already acknowledged that he has killed a lot of Ukrainian politicians across Europe. So we know that they are doing that, but nobody dares to say something because that would make the whole narrative to collapse. And everything is based on that narrative, not on the reality of facts. So when we talk, even today, you have people saying that Ukraine can still win. But what is victory? How do you define victory? How do you define the defeat of Russia? Nobody has defined this. So again, we have words. We don't have real and clearly defined objectives. And when you don't have objectives, you cannot have a strategy, because the nature of strategy is how to reach an objective. So we just have words, we just have narratives, but we don't have strategies to address problems. And this is not just about Ukraine. We talk about energy. We're talking about the whole issue of sanctions, for instance. We talk about sanctions, but we didn't realize that the new sanctions that are considered today by people such as Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal in the US, these people have elaborated plans that, in fact, may be catastrophic for us, not for the Russians. But nobody realized this because we are beyond facts. We are beyond facts. We are beyond reality. We are living today, and we have a polity in the West, especially in Europe. We have a polity that is only based on a narrative. And that's the difficulty for the Trump administration, because the Trump administration has a clear objective. But again, they don't have a real strategy because they didn't understand exactly what this conflict was about. And they have no way to embark the Europeans into that strategy because they don't have one. And that's exactly the situation we have. Sorry, I was long,
Yeah.
but
No. But it's interesting, this thing with narratives, because I noticed something. Yes, the weird small things all the time. For example, if you say, "Well, the Russians are winning," then that's seen as, well, that's a pro-Russian argument, so it supports their narrative, which means you're not supporting Ukraine. So when people talk, they feel they have to say that Ukraine is winning, because otherwise you're not being supportive. But all you're doing by pretending they're winning is to delay negotiations and not act upon, necessary, take necessary actions to actually stop this. Because if they're losing territory and men every day, you're not pro-Ukrainian when live in La La Land and pretend as if they're winning. It's very strange. But there's also this interesting thing, as you spoke about the OSCE, that we also can't admit that the Russians were pushing for such an inclusive security architecture, because this is seen as then supporting the Russians. But from 1975, when we had this Helsinki Accords, this was supposed to be the foundation of cooperation between East and West. This was the foundation of the Charter of Paris for New Europe in 1990, the same principles, Europe without dividing lines, based on indivisible security. And that was also the foundation for the OSCE. Now, as you also said, when the Americans realized the OSCE is not great for accommodating American hegemony, they instead went for NATO expansion. But after the Russians understood the OSCE would not lay the foundation for New Europe, Yeltsin asked to join NATO. Putin asked about possibility to join NATO. They under under President Medvedev in 2008, they called for a new pan-European security architecture. Putin in 2010 asked for a EU-Russian union. I mean, they did over and over again. And it was our side that said, no, 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 we will stick with bloc politics. We will expand the military bloc closer towards your borders, even though it will result most likely in conflict. And this is what perplexes me, because it seems that the Europeans, we pushing European security architecture that more or less logic dictated had to end in conflict at some point, as George Kennan and others recognized. Yet we didn't prepare for this war. We demilitarize while we set ourselves on a collision course, which is strange. And I feel we're doing something similar as we speak. That is, there's this escalation of the NATO-Russia conflict, not only the recent threats by, for example, Merz in Germany, that will now start engaging in more direct attacks on Russia by actually using the Taurus missiles to strike deep inside Russia, which would be, I guess, reasonable for the Russians to argue that this would be a German attack on Russia. But we also see, Finland joining NATO, the US building military base across Scandinavia. They want the logistics so they can bring American troops quickly to the Russian borders. And now, of course, how would the opponent react? Well, the Russians have revived the Leningrad military district. And now we see people saying, well, oh, the Russians are being aggressive. But also this idea that we can seize the Russian, what we call the shadow fleet. Now the Russian Navy is increasing its presence in the Baltic Sea to assist or to protect its commercial vessels. And again, this is seen as something aggressive. It's just extraordinary. That is, if you recognize the security competition and the security dilemma, then none of these things that happened should have been a surprise. The whole idea that more weapons is more security is not always the case. But what are we doing in Europe then? Do the Europeans no longer understand basic international security, or is this a deliberate effort to sabotage our own relations with Russia? I ask us, I saw this German TV talk show where you had I think it was a German general who argued, well, the Russians are building up a military presence close to Finland. And this was evidence that after they're done with Ukraine, they want to move on. I mean, I would hate to believe that a German general would be this misinformed. So again, are they deceiving the public, or you have a German general actually believing that we're going to build up Finland as a front line and Russia wouldn't take any respond in any matter? For me, I have a very hard time to make sense of these actions.
Absolutely. I totally agree what you say. And a French politician, I think it was ex-Premier Minister or First Minister or Premier Minister, Prime Minister, sorry, Michel Rocard, who used to say, never underestimate stupidity. And
I like that.
And I think we are in this model. I think we are exactly there. When you listen to these, remember, I mean, you mentioned this general, but remember Liz Truss, as she was saying on TV that she was ready to launch a global nuclear war to destroy Russia. I mean, she was asked by the interviewer, the journalist, are you ready to launch a global nuclear war? And she said, well, global annihilation even. She said, he asked, are you ready to do it? And she said, yes. So we have people, sometimes you can ask yourself, what are they thinking about? How do they feel about the current issues that we have in Europe, and how they see the future of that? I mean, we see that obviously with, I mentioned the energy, and of course, when we talk about Nord Stream, but not only Nord Stream. Today, what we have, Ursula von der Leyen saying that the Russians decided to cut the gas.
Yeah.
So we have to go into literally lies in order to justify actions that we took in Europe without thinking about the consequences. And
but here's the dangerous part. When they say this nonsense, the Russians cut off the energy, it wasn't us. it's almost a test of loyalty, not honesty, because no one can speak against them. Because if they speak against them, it's almost as if you're taking the defense of the Kremlin. So you can't speak again. So your the loyalty test is to stand there, listen to lies and stupidity, and nod along and pretend as if this is right. Sorry for the interruption.
No, absolutely, absolutely right. And that relates to what you said before, that when you say that Russia is winning, then you are pro-Russian. The problem is, as a military, and if you read Sun Tzu and all that, the art of strategy, and you know that the worst mistake you can make at war is to underestimate your enemy. That's the worst mistake you can make. Now, by repeating constantly that the Russians are weak, that they are unable to fight, that they lack ammunition, lack tanks and soldiers, and so on and so forth. In fact, we portrayed a picture of Russia which is actually much weaker than what it is actually. And when you study, and I have written many books about this in the past, about Maskirovka and the art of camouflage and disinformation in the Soviet times. The whole purpose of Maskirovka is to show how weak you are when you are not. So today we are confused because we see that very little, in fact, in reality, I'm not talking about what our media say, but if you look in the if you analyze the communication, the narrative of the Russians, there is little indication that they try to show their to show that they are weak. They are not practicing Maskirovka because we do that for them. That's the paradox of this situation. We have created, normally we would expect the Russians to say that they are weaker than they actually are, in order precisely to have this massive force behind. And when you start attacking them, you feel that you will attack a weak enemy, and in reality, it's a strong one. But that's exactly what we have done instead of what the Russians have done. We have done the Russian Maskirovka, in fact, by constantly portraying the Russians are weaker than they are. And it's not just in a military term, it's also in economic terms. Coming back to the issue of gas and exports and sanctions and shadow fleet, and we still think that by imposing sanctions on Russia, they will not be able to survive. That in fact their economy is weaker than we might think. And that's exactly the opposite in reality. And that, remember, I remember on the 1st March of 2022, the Minister of Economy in France, Monsieur Le Maire, he said on radio, on the radio, it was Europe numéro 1, he said, what the aim of our sanctions is to make Russia to collapse, and that will happen within weeks. And he said the Russian population will suffer from that, but it's a war and we are conducting this. So he was convinced that the sanction they were applying then, and we are talking about the 1st of March 2022, was the first sanction package. Since then, there have been 16 additional sanction packages, meaning that they were underestimating the capabilities and the capacities of the Russians massively. And we are still on that when we talk about the sanctions, when we talk about the sanctions that we are currently being elaborated, because now they are working on the 18th sanction package and even talking about a 19th one. But all the context of these sanctions are still the idea that Russia is weak and we just need a small effort to make it collapse completely. But it's far from the reality. And that relates again to this picture that we have of Russia, which is a wrong picture. We have the picture of this gas station masquerading into a country, or country masquerading, yes, a country masquerading into a gas station, or vice versa, sorry, that John McCain used to say. Well, exactly not in that. It's exactly the opposite. And as long as we will not be able to acknowledge that Russia is much stronger than we assessed, we will go into these political mistakes, and we will continue to go in this spiral towards defeat, because that's exactly where we are. We are in the spiraling, and that's exactly what we are witnessing on the ground, by the way, in Ukraine, that we have a spiraling defeat of the Ukrainians on the battlefield. And all that can, and the danger of that is that it can lead the European to take extreme measures to counter this situation. And that's exactly what you mentioned about Fred Merz, who said that now they can use these Taurus missiles and other long-range missiles because it is authorized, which apparently is not the case. He's bluffing somehow, apparently, but because the Americans have not given their green light for the use of such long-range missile, because there is US technology in that and they don't want to be involved. And I think they have a constant approach to that since Biden, in fact. There have been a small change in the policy in May 2024, as the Russians started the offensive in the area of Kharkov. And in order to counter this offensive, the Biden administration accepted to extend the ability of Ukrainian to strike into the depth of Russia by creating so-called ops box. And this ops box was in fact a box that was a kind of an extending range, or limited range into Russia, where the Ukrainian could use long-range missile on the European territory. But it was limited to this ops box. And
But
my personal view
oh,
is
sorry.
that sorry.
Oh, no, I was yeah, no, I wanted to ask about this yeah, the outcome, but sorry, you finished your sentence.
So what I just wanted to say is that since then, I think the Americans have not changed their policy. They don't want their weapons to be used in the depths of the, I mean, the strategic depths of the Russian territory. And I think Merz is in fact bluffing about this. That's my personal understanding of that. And again, this goes into this scheme of trying to counter the Russian success on the ground by having more extreme rhetoric in the West. They cannot go much beyond rhetoric because they are lacking the resources to provide Ukraine with useful resources to counter the Russian advance. But this is the idea. So you're the more we go into this conflict, the more the Europeans will go on lying, on developing rhetoric, and to go on extreme measures. And we will see that they will welcome other terrorist attacks in Russia, because the whole purpose of the game is to weaken the Russia again, to create a political crisis within Russia and all that. So we may have this kind of escalation, which might not be an escalation in the conventional sense of the word, but it may be an escalation in the sense of more extreme and illegal measures will be taken against Russia. Sorry.
Yeah. I know it's just another comment first on the underestimating the opponents, because again, this is the media which we see now, the Russians, fighting with shovels, etc. And well, in reality, we see the more credible reports coming also from the United States is that the Russians are now pumping out, tanks and different armored vehicles at a huge pace. However, the majority of them are being sent to the rear to build up a huge, a punching force for the future. So it's not even being sent to the front, and so it is very different from what they're saying. And indeed, I feel often there's more honesty than on the Ukrainian side than you find in the West, because in Ukraine, at least, I go and see a lot of, they have panel discussions where you have soldiers come back from the front, and they're very open about it. They're saying, listen, because they get questions like, how easy is to defeat the Russians because they're hopeless and backwards, and say, you shouldn't be saying this. This is you're deluding people. We come to the front, expect to see backwards, exhausted Russians who don't want to be there, but they volunteered. They got a lot of training. They come, with excellent military equipment. They're coordinated, and then, they get slaughtered on the front lines, the Ukrainians, because they walk into something they didn't expect. And but again, these are the phrases we have to repeat. Indeed, here in Norway, I made a point at a podcast that the Ukrainians are losing many more men than the Russians, and this was just blasted as some form of propaganda. And you can cite the amount of weapons they bring to the front. The missiles, the drones, the air defenses. But nothing matters. It's just if we have to support the moral of morality of the if you have the Ukrainian fighting force, we can't speak poorly of them. So this is everything is a narrative. It's quite extraordinary. But
Absolutely.
but my last question was more about do you see this going towards a military solution? I don't see. I think the United States is willing to meet, well, at least Trump is willing to meet the demands of Russia, but the US is very divided and not very. Yeah, it's very indecisive. The Europeans seems to be, well, let's call it not rational in terms of the objectives or the demands they put forward. So if there's no meeting point, also the Ukrainians, they're not moving either. So, and also given that the Russians' demand are so strong, if there is no political settlement to be had, are we moving towards a military solution? And what exactly would this look like? Because the front lines now, if you only see over the past few days, how many pockets are being formed, how many Ukrainians are being trapped inside these pockets, territories collapsing. This can't go on forever. Again, it's a big country. The Ukrainians keep fighting on, quite heroically, one can say, given that I thought they would have collapsed already. But how do you see this ending? In a military solution, and will the Europeans simply stand by, or if you look into your glass ball, which we don't have, well, what do you see happening over the next few weeks?
Well, as you said, I don't have a crystal ball,
Yeah.
but I think that everybody is striving towards a military solution. In fact, I think the Russians today are more or less they have lost their hope that it might be a political solution. That's my personal understanding, and they are more and more ready to fight. And you had a recent article in the New York Times when you had Russian soldiers saying that, well, they don't like war, as anybody can imagine, but they are ready to fight for the success of the country. And I think that's more or less the stance that you see. And if you see the polls, and I made regularly on different channels, I made the this, let's say, I talk about the polls that are made by the Levada Center in Moscow, which is considered as a foreign agent. Remember, that is considered as a foreign agent. But the thing is that every month they ask the same question to a set of people, and therefore you can compare the position all across the conflict, and you can see that since the beginning of the military operation in February 2022, the support to Vladimir Putin remains around between 85 to 87%, extremely strong. the support to the military operation remains at something like 75%. I mean, more or less constantly since the beginning of the military operation, meaning that you have probably, not probably, you have something like 13, 12, between 12 and 14% of the population who is not really supporting the military operation. But 75% do support the military operation. And then you have, and that's very interesting, because when you look at those who are in favor of a negotiation process towards the continuation of war, you have a very clear majority in favor of a negotiated solution. And I don't have the figures right now, but it's above 50% who are in favor of a negotiated process. And that has been more or less, you have 50% of the population who is in favor of a negotiated process, while those who are in favor of continuation of war is around 20%. Meaning that the people in Russia support the government, supports the military operation, but would prefer a negotiated solution to the conflict. And that, in fact, is very consistent with what we have from the government itself. Because obviously they are engaged in a military operation, they want to continue the military operation, but they always stated that their preference was a negotiated solution. Now, who doesn't want to negotiate? These are the Europeans and, of course, Zelensky, who is even prevented by its own decree, is prevented to negotiate. So there is an institutional obstacle to negotiations on the Ukrainian/European side. So we are heading towards a solution which is not the best solution from the side of the Russians, but they feel constrained to have a military solution. And that's what Vladimir Putin said a few months ago. He said, we'll finish them off. So meaning that, in fact, we'll probably continue to have this military operation. It may extend towards Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, and others. I don't know. They will certainly try to reach the borders of the 4 oblasts. I mean, one is already, Lugansk is more or less 100% under Russian control, but the 3 others, Kherson, Zaporozhye, and Donetsk, are those who need to be conquered so far. So they will continue that. Maybe they will go beyond this. My view is that the Russians will make every effort to avoid going into the western part of Ukraine, because this is the most ultra-nationalistic and probably the one that may cause more problem in the long term. But between where they are now and western Ukraine, you still have room for military operations. And my personal view is that those military operations will continue up to the point where Ukraine will see the Russian advance as unbearable. Because just imagine that the Russians will go into Odessa. That would cut Ukraine from the Black Sea. That would cut Ukraine for a huge part of its economy, meaning that will become to be totally unbearable for Ukraine. And that might be, I don't know, again, that may come before, but I think that at least if the Russians would occupy Odessa, that would create a situation where Ukraine will be constrained to enter a negotiation process. And that's probably what the Russians want to aim. So they will not have a full-fledged military victory in the sense that they will occupy the whole Ukraine. They don't want that. But they will continue the military operation up to the point where the Ukrainians will be forced to accept a negotiated settlement, because then they will become this kind of a rump nation that was described by Medvedev a few months ago, where he issued a map of the future Ukraine, and you had Ukraine reduced to a very small, tiny territory around Kiev, and the rest being returned to the Poles and to the Hungarian, to the Romanians, and things like this. And of course, the bulk of the country returned to Russia. So again, this is probably an extremist view of the issue of the conflict, but we are heading towards this. And that is now up to the Ukrainian and the European leadership to understand what is exactly at stake. And my view is that what we have to understand is that what is at stake today is not the survival of Ukraine as we knew it before 2022 or even before 2021, but it's the survival of Ukraine as a state, period, regardless of in which border. Meaning that the issue is, do we want Ukraine to exist in some form, or do we want Ukraine to disappear? And the more we go into this conflict, the more we will have to make this kind of thinking and try to elaborate a solution based on what is at stake, really. And for the Ukrainians, this is that. And you have more and more Ukrainians. You know, I'm not considered as a pro-Ukrainian by Western media. They consider me, of course, as a pro-Russian, because I tried to have a balanced understanding of the conflict. And of course, I exposed the strengths of the Russians in this conflict. But interestingly enough, I'm living in Brussels. You have a lot of Ukrainian refugees in Brussels. And on many occasions, Ukrainian refugees stopped me on the street, on the sidewalk, to thank me about what I'm saying. Because Ukrainians said, we don't have the real picture of what's happening in our country. And these guys, I talked to them we had, and it's not just one, it's several of them. And they told me what we hear in the media, in the Western media, is not what's happening. That's give exactly the wrong understanding of the situation. And because we have the wrong understanding of the situation, why would you help further a country that is winning? And we have said that Ukraine was winning, so why would you help them? So it's exactly the paradox of that situation that affects the Ukrainian. And when in my books, by the way, if you read my books, you will see that the majority of the sources, I mean, when I say majority, it's probably 95%, they come from Ukraine. Because within Ukraine, you have a lot of people, I mean, even the media are more honest than the Western media, because they see the reality despite censorship and all that, because this does exist in Ukraine. But at least they have their report things that they even contradict what the Western media are saying about the same event. So meaning that the Ukrainians need, it's exactly what I said before. You cannot win against an enemy that you portray, you underestimate. And the Ukrainians instinctively have understood that. And for that reason, they have a more candid approach to the conflict than we have in the West. Now, we have to be very careful when I made this kind of assessment. Here we have to make a difference between what the government is saying and what the population is saying. You are talking about the losses. When you talk about when the government speak about the losses, they are acknowledging something like 80,000 fatalities, so killed soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers. That's what they acknowledge at the government level. But you have Ukrainian NGOs that make the count exactly the same as Mediazona is doing for Russia. You know that Mediazona is a website, is an opposition website, by the way, that works with the BBC to have an estimate of the Russian losses during the war, and they based their assessment on observations made on the social networks and things like this. So the methodology is probably not flawless, but at least they have a methodology. And they come today, as of today, they come with a figure for the number of Russians killed, which is around 105,000 for the Russian killed for the whole conflict. So that's an opposition media. So it has nothing to do with the Russian government. It's an opposition media. Now, if you look at the same process that has been done by Ukrainian organization, you read for the Ukrainians killed, not casualties, killed, fatalities. There are more than 750,000 killed for Ukraine. So we have two media which are essentially not linked to the Russian government, who in fact give a figure completely different from what the Ukrainian government says, and which is repeated by our media. The reality is the reality, and we cannot solve a situation. I suffer. That's a credo of all the intelligence. From the way you assess a situation derives the way you solve it. If you don't understand the situation as it is, you will not be able to solve it. And that's exactly the dilemma in which the Europeans and the Ukrainian government is today. But that explains also why you have something that nobody talks about, will be the subject of my next book, which is published next week. It is the development of a resistance, not in the Russian occupied territories, but the resistance in the Kiev territories. And that's something nobody talks about. But you have a Ukrainian resistance against Kiev, which even is in the western part of the country, that attacks railways exactly in the same way that you had the French resistance attacking the German convoys after June 1944 in northern France and in Belgium, where the resistance destroyed the railways and derailed train and all that to avoid reinforcement and ammunition coming to the front. And the Ukrainian resistance that you have today in the era of Odessa, Nikolaev, Kiev, Kiev, it's a little bit less, but in the western part, in the region of Rovno and so on, you have this resistance building up and almost daily attacking convoys of ammunition coming from the Polish border towards the front in the eastern part of the country. So, but nobody talks about it because that's definitely against the narrative that we have. And that's simply the result of having this discrepancy between what the government says about the conflict and the position and the understanding of the population. And they see that the situation, and especially with forced recruitment and all that, the discontent of the population is growing in Ukraine. And probably what the Russians are doing now by saying, okay, we'll have a military solution, that will in fact amplify this resistance within Ukraine and amplify the instability and the political crisis within what the territory which is controlled by Kiev in Ukraine. So we may have drastic changes in the coming months due to the changing situation within Ukraine. within Ukraine, the political situation. Again, I have no crystal ball, but I think these are signs that are very interesting to observe, which are beyond what our media report. But these are facts that, again, you cannot ignore simply.
Well, I've spoken to Ukrainians in this country as well who expressed that they feel they have to be a bit careful or cautious what they say, because it's also the Ukrainians who have to play the role of, wanting to fight to the last man and give us weapons, let us fight. This is the good Ukrainians, which we like. The other Ukrainians who argue that this was not ideal. They don't want to repeat the Slava Ukraini's slogans. All this we don't really want to hear from them here. They don't fit the Ukrainian which we liked, which was also a problem before 2014. That is,
Exactly. Yeah.
we just want to hear from the Ukrainian who wanted to join NATO and hated Russia, even though at that time they were a minority.
Absolutely.
Anyways, Colonel Bod, thank you so much for your time, and
That
hope
was my
you'll come back
pleasure.
on the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks.